There were four of us: George, William Samuel Harris, myself, my friends call me Jay, and Montmorency, my fox terrier. We were all sitting in my room, smoking and talking about how we were feeling. To put it simply, we were all convinced that something was terribly wrong with our health. Harris mentioned that he sometimes felt dizzy, and George said he felt the same way. As for me, my main concern was my liver. I was sure something was wrong with it, and I had read a book about liver diseases, so I knew I had every single symptom listed. It's funny how you can read about an illness and suddenly you're convinced you have it. I'd done this countless times before. On one occasion, I went to the British Museum to check out a minor health issue. But instead of sticking to the original problem, I found myself diving into an entire world of medical conditions. After reading for a while, I had diagnosed myself with every illness under the sun, except for one: housemaid's knee. For some strange reason, that one condition eluded me, and it bothered me. By the time I left the museum, I was no longer a healthy person. I was convinced that I had so many ailments. My life was practically over. In a panic, I went to see my doctor, an old friend who had a great deal of patience with me. Whenever I was convinced I was ill, he would humor me, give me a quick examination, and tell me I was perfectly fine. I assumed that this time would be no different. I was certain that he would find all sorts of problems. "What's wrong with you now?" he asked, looking at me with his usual calm. "Well," I replied, "I could tell you what's wrong, but I'll be dead before I finish. I have so many diseases, I might as well list what isn't wrong with me. I don't have housemaid's knee, but I seem to have everything else." He listened carefully, examined me, and then wrote me a prescription. I was so convinced he'd write me something for my many ailments that I didn't even bother to read it. I just slipped it into my pocket and went straight to the chemist. When I handed it over, the chemist read it, laughed a little, and handed it back to me. "I don't think you have what's listed here," he said, grinning. I looked at him, a bit confused. "But you're a chemist, aren't you?" I asked. He nodded. "Yes, I'm a chemist, but I'm not a hotel or a restaurant. Let me explain the prescription for you." I took the prescription out of my pocket and read it aloud. "Every 6 hours, eat a pound of fresh meat, drink a pint of beer every morning, walk 10 miles, go to bed no later than 11 p.m., and stop reading books about things you don't understand." It was strange advice, but I followed it. And, oddly enough, it worked. I started to feel better. Of course, I still had my so-called liver problem, the main symptom of which was a constant feeling of tiredness and disinterest in anything that required effort. But other than that, I was doing quite well. I thought back to when I was a child, and people used to call me lazy. They never knew that my liver was to blame. They would just tell me to go and do my work, but I could never seem to find the energy. Back then, doctors didn't know much about liver diseases. Instead of giving me treatment for my liver, they gave me a good knock on the head, and somehow that worked. After every blow, I'd go straight to my work. It wasn't much, but it helped me stay in motion. That evening, George, Harris, and I sat together in my room. We were still discussing our various illnesses, each of us contributing stories of how we felt, how we suffered, and what we thought the causes might be. I explained to George and Harris how I felt in the mornings, while Harris talked about the discomforts he felt when he went to bed. Then George told us about his own issues at night. George, though, was the one who always thought he had something wrong with him. But truthfully, there was never anything wrong with him. Mrs. Poppets, the housekeeper, brought us our dinner. We weren't very hungry. We had some meat, onions, and cake, but we couldn't really enjoy it. Our minds were so consumed by our health issues. We all agreed that our illnesses were a result of too much work. "We need a break," Harris said, shaking his head. "We need a change," George added, his eyes tired. "Our minds are exhausted from all this work." "I know what we need," I said. "We need to go to the countryside. We'll find a quiet place with no people. We can relax and get away from everything." Harris immediately objected. "Oh, how boring. Everyone in the country goes to bed at 8 o'clock, and you can't even find a decent newspaper." "No, I want a place that's more lively." I suggested a sea trip, but Harris quickly dismissed it. "A sea trip will just make you seasick. You spend most of the week feeling awful, then finally, on Sunday, you're able to eat again and walk around. And that's when it's time to leave." Finally, George spoke up with a better idea. "What about a river trip? We'll have fresh air, peaceful surroundings, and we'll get some good exercise. We'll sleep well at night and feel relaxed." Harris and I agreed. Montmorency, however, wasn't too thrilled with the idea. He looked at us as if to say, "I don't like this. It's not for me." He wasn't fond of nature and preferred a more lively atmosphere. But in the end, we outvoted him. The trip was decided. The following evening, we met again to finalize the plans for our river trip. Harris, as usual, immediately took control. "George, get me some paper and a pencil," he instructed. "Jay, write the list." It was always the same with Harris. He directed the show, but never did much of the actual work. It reminded me of my Uncle Podger, who had a talent for turning even the simplest task into a chaotic family project. Once we had the materials ready, we started to plan the trip. "We'll start from Kingston," I suggested. "Harris, you and I will get the boat there, and then we'll row upriver to Chertsey. We'll meet George there." George worked in the city and couldn't leave until the afternoon. He spent his weekdays at the bank from 10 to 4 o'clock, and on Saturdays, they kindly woke him early at 2 o'clock and sent him out. The next task was figuring out where we would sleep. George and I weren't keen on staying at inns. We preferred camping in the countryside, far away from the bustle of city life. "Just imagine it," I said. "We'll sleep under the stars by the river. The sound of the water will lull us to sleep, and we'll wake up refreshed in the morning." Harris, however, wasn't so enthusiastic. "What if it rains?" he asked. "You'll be soaked, and you'll be stuck with a wet tent and no place to dry off." Harris was right, of course. Camping in the rain was never fun. "Okay, we'll camp if the weather is nice, but if it rains, we'll find a hotel," I said, conceding. Montmorency, my dog, looked unimpressed. He wasn't fond of the quiet countryside and much preferred the noise and activity of the towns. But since we were outvoting him, he reluctantly agreed. Now that we had a plan for the first part of the trip, we moved on to the next item: what to pack. We spent the rest of the evening sorting through our things. The next evening, we gathered again to finish preparing for the trip. "Right, let's get everything ready," Harris said, as if he were orchestrating a grand project. We quickly realized that we had far too much to take with us. The first packing list was a disaster, so we decided to start over. George suggested we pack lightly, so we could travel with only the essentials. "We don't need anything heavy," George said, emphasizing the importance of a small, efficient boat. "A simple canvas cover will do for a tent, and that's all we need." We started with clothes. George was the expert on packing clothes for trips, or so he claimed. We later realized that this was a bit of an exaggeration. For some reason, we had trouble agreeing on what clothes to bring. There were too many items to choose from, and each of us thought the other was packing the wrong thing. After some debate, we finally settled on what to bring. Next, we turned to the food. George was adamant about the menu, claiming that he knew exactly what we needed. We would have a hearty breakfast, a simple lunch, and filling dinners. For breakfast, George suggested eggs, bacon, bread, butter, jam, tea, and sugar. Lunch would be simple: cold meat, biscuits, and fruit. For dinner, we would have meat pies, fruit pies, and green vegetables. We all agreed on these choices, though I did voice my concern about the cheese. It was always a disaster when cheese sat around for too long. "We're not bringing any cheese," George said firmly. "The smell will ruin everything in a day." He was right, of course. But our troubles weren't over. The next decision was the stove. George suggested a camping stove, but we all agreed that we needed to avoid paraffin oil stoves at all costs. We had learned the hard way on a previous trip that the smell of paraffin oil seemed to follow us everywhere. It stuck to our clothes, our food, and even the countryside. With everything packed, we moved to the next task: organizing the hampers. I had volunteered to handle this, though George and Harris made themselves comfortable in the armchairs, leaving me to do all the work. I had wanted them to help, but it quickly became clear that I was on my own. At one point, Harris asked, "Did you pack the boots?" I hadn't. After a quick search, I packed the boots, only to realize I had forgotten my toothbrush. Panic set in as I frantically searched through the suitcase. Eventually, I found it, but by then, it was too late. Everyone was getting impatient, and I had to pack everything again. When I was finally finished, George casually asked, "Is the soap in there?" "I don't care about the soap," I replied, frustrated. "Let's just get going." We finally closed the suitcase. It was now well past midnight. We were finally done, and we could all go to bed. The next morning, Mrs. Poppets came into my room to tell me that it was nearly 9 a.m. I jumped out of bed in panic. "What time is it?" I exclaimed, as I quickly woke up Harris and George. It felt like we had all overslept. We scrambled to get ready, realizing we had packed our toothbrushes but had to dig through the suitcase to get them out. This turned out to be a longer task than expected. Finally, we managed to get some breakfast. While we ate, George read the newspaper. He told us about the recent accidents on the river and the bad weather forecast. After finishing, George left for work, while Harris and I finished our meal. Montmorency, in the meantime, invited his two friends over, and they got into a loud argument that caused even more chaos in the house. Once we were finished, we took our luggage outside. A small crowd had gathered to watch us, and they all stared at the massive pile of bags, hampers, and boxes. It must have looked like we were preparing for a 2-year expedition, not a river trip. After waiting about 20 minutes for a taxi, we finally got one and made our way to Waterloo Station. We took the 11:05 train to Kingston, and from there, we headed to the river. Our boat was waiting under the bridge, and Harris and I started loading our luggage into it. We climbed in, feeling quite pleased with ourselves. Montmorency, however, didn't look as thrilled. He seemed to sense that the trip was not going to be as fun as we had hoped. Harris, in his bright red and orange blazer, took the oars, and we began our journey. The weather was lovely, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed perfect. We passed Hampton Court Palace, and Harris, always full of stories, asked, "Have you ever been to the maze here?" He told us about the time he had gone in with a friend. Harris claimed to have studied the map of the maze before entering, so he knew exactly how to get out. They went in, and Harris confidently said they would take the first turn to the right every time, and they would be out in 10 minutes. But as they wandered, they bumped into people who had been lost for 45 minutes. In an effort to be helpful, Harris assured them he knew the way, and they followed him. Of course, in the end, Harris got lost too. The people who had been following him grew angry as they realized they were still in the maze. Eventually, an old keeper came back from his lunch break and helped everyone find their way out. Harris shrugged it off, suggesting we should let George try the maze on our return trip. We continued our journey, heading towards Shepperton. Harris mentioned he wanted to stop and visit the church there, but I wasn't keen. So, I steered the boat in such a way that, when he wasn't looking, his cap flew off and landed in the river. He hurriedly pulled it out and, of course, forgot all about the church. As we neared Weybridge, we saw George waving to us, dressed in his signature bright blazer. Montmorency barked excitedly, and Harris and I shouted at George, who waved his cap in return. The lock keeper on the riverbank was startled and rushed over, thinking someone had fallen into the water. But when he saw no one in danger, he returned to his duties. With George finally on board, we put him to work. He didn't want to, of course, but we were determined to make him pull the boat. George, always complaining about his hard day at the bank, reluctantly took the rope and began walking along the riverbank, towing us along. As we sailed, we remembered a funny incident that George had witnessed once. He had seen a couple towing a boat behind them, but they hadn't noticed that the boat was missing. They kept walking until they were towing George's boat instead. By the time they realized it, it was too late to stop. The couple was surprised and confused, but George took it in stride, laughing all the way. That evening, we decided to spend the night at Pinton Hook. We tied the boat to a tree and started preparing the canvas cover. What seemed like a simple task turned into a full-on disaster. George and Harris struggled with the metal rods that were supposed to hold up the cover. As usual, they were completely confused. After much arguing and struggling, they were both tangled inside the cover, flailing about and shouting for help. Montmorency, ever the observer, watched with amusement as they wrestled with the cover. I stood by, waiting for the chaos to subside, while Montmorency gave me a look that seemed to say, "This whole thing is ridiculous." Eventually, after some time, we got the cover in place, but not without a lot of shouting and a few choice words. It was late, and we were all exhausted, but at least the cover was up, and we were ready for the night. We stopped at Kempton Park for lunch under the shade of the trees. It was a perfect spot to rest and enjoy our food. Harris, who usually complained about everything, was surprisingly quiet, perhaps because the fresh air and good food calmed him down. After our meal, we continued on our journey, heading towards Sunbury Lock, which we passed around 3:30 p.m. From there, we rode on to Walton, a town with a rich history. It was the site where Julius Caesar had camped with his army, and Queen Elizabeth I had also visited during her reign. We were enjoying the day when we reached Shepperton. I noticed Harris glancing at the church as we passed by. He loved visiting churches, and I could see him starting to make plans to stop and take a look. I wasn't particularly fond of church visits, so I quickly steered the boat, trying to avoid Harris's desire to stop. Just as I had hoped, His cap flew off in the process and landed in the water. As Harris scrambled to retrieve it, he completely forgot about the church and was too busy fussing over his soggy hat. It was getting late. We decided to stop for the night and camp by the river. We tied the boat to a large tree and began setting up the canvas cover. Exhausted from the day's events, we decided to settle down for the night. It had been a long and eventful start to our trip, and we were looking forward to getting a good night's rest before continuing our journey the next day. After setting up camp and getting settled for the night, we began to prepare supper. We were all hungry after a day of rowing and wanted something hot to eat. We decided to make tea first. The kettle was placed on the stove, but we didn't want to show too much interest in it. If we paid too much attention to the kettle, it would never boil. We knew that we had to pretend to ignore it for a while. This was a tactic we had learned before. If you wait long enough, the water will boil itself. The kettle was slow to start, but after a few minutes, the steam began to rise. We were finally ready to begin preparing our dinner. Harris, ever the ambitious cook, volunteered to make scrambled eggs. "When I make scrambled eggs, everyone loves them," he proudly announced. George and I were skeptical, but we allowed him to take the lead. Harris confidently took the frying pan and began cracking the eggs into it. Of course, things didn't go quite as smoothly as planned. Harris's first mistake was putting the eggs directly on his trousers, which caused the egg yolks to drip everywhere. He then accidentally splattered some of the eggs up his arms. Despite these minor setbacks, Harris was determined to continue. He placed all 6 eggs into the pan, hoping for the best. He stirred them furiously, but in doing so, he managed to burn his fingers several times. Each time he burned himself, he jumped around the stove, dancing and flailing his arms in the air. To us, it looked like a strange cooking ritual, and George and I couldn't help but laugh. We assumed this was just part of Harris's unique way of cooking scrambled eggs. He made several exaggerated gestures, as if he were trying to summon the perfect scrambled egg through some sort of magical dance. Meanwhile, Montmorency, who had been watching the whole process with curiosity, got a little too close to the pan. He stuck his nose over the frying pan, only to burn himself in the process. In true Montmorency fashion, he started running around in circles, barking and jumping as if he too were trying to follow Harris's cooking routine. It was quite the spectacle. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the scrambled eggs were ready. Harris served them up, but to our disappointment, there was hardly anything to eat. The 6 eggs had cooked down to just a tiny spoonful of burnt, scrambled mess. Harris blamed the frying pan. "I need a better pan," he declared. "This one's no good." We agreed, and after finishing what little we could, we decided that perhaps we wouldn't try Harris's scrambled eggs again. At least not until we had better equipment. But despite the burnt eggs, we were all in good spirits. We sat back, relaxed, and began talking as the evening set in. The day's adventures had tired us out, but we were looking forward to the next leg of the trip. After breakfast, the sun was shining brightly, and it was a beautiful, warm morning. We were all sitting on the riverbank near Runnymede, where King John had signed the Magna Carta. I began to imagine what it must have been like when the document was signed all those centuries ago. The scene was vivid in my mind. Noblemen gathered around, horses pawing at the ground, the sound of quills scratching on parchment. George came over, interrupting my daydream. "When you're done with your royal reflections, could you help wash the dishes?" he asked. I reluctantly agreed and set about cleaning the frying pan with some grass, which wasn't ideal, but it worked. George handed me his wet shirt, and I used that to finish the job. It wasn't the most glamorous way to do it, but it got the job done. We continued our journey up the river and stopped for lunch near Monkey Island, where we had cold meat. But in the middle of our meal, I asked, "Where's the mustard?" Harris turned to me and simply said, "We forgot to bring it." At that moment, we realized how much we had been craving mustard. It seemed like the one thing that could make our cold meat taste better. But without it, everything tasted bland. "Well, life is boring without mustard," George said, sighing. The absence of mustard turned out to be a surprisingly large disappointment, and we ate the rest of our lunch in silence, each of us thinking about the mustard we could have had. But, as always, we found a way to move past our minor grievances. Soon after, George brought out a tin of pineapple. We all smiled, happy at the prospect of something sweet. The bright label on the tin seemed to promise us happiness, but as it often does, reality had a different plan. When we went to open the tin, we realized that we had forgotten the tin opener. Harris tried to open it with a small knife, but only managed to cut his hand. Then George attempted to use a pair of scissors, but they flew out of his hands and almost hit him in the eye. I thought I might have better luck with a piece of metal, but instead, I dropped it and it fell into the river. The tin mockingly bobbed in the water. Frustrated, I started hitting it with a piece of wood, and soon, everyone was joining in. We battered the tin into a completely new shape, trying everything to open it, but it still wouldn't budge. In the end, I gave up, threw it into the river, and we continued our journey. It was only later, after we reached Maidenhead, that we realized how ridiculous it all was. The wind picked up, and with it, our spirits lifted. We quickly set up the sail and felt the boat begin to move faster as the wind pushed us up the river. I was steering, while George and Harris enjoyed the ride. The river looked magical with the sun setting in the distance, casting a red light across the water. But in the midst of this peaceful setting, our calm was interrupted when we collided with a small fishing boat carrying 3 fishermen. We hadn't seen them until it was too late, and before we knew it, our boat had crashed into theirs. The fishermen, now soaked, were furious and started yelling at us. Harris, always quick to make light of things, stood up and said, "Well, I guess you must be bored out here on the water all day. It's a good thing we brought some excitement to your lives." The 3 fishermen didn't find it amusing. They yelled back at us, cursing us in a way I had never heard before. Their words weren't just insults. They were creative and long, curses for both the present and the future. They cursed our parents, our families, our pets, and even our jobs. We sat in stunned silence, unsure how to respond to such a level of animosity. Finally, as we continued our journey, George took the helm, muttering under his breath, "This is why we should have gone to the theater." By the time we reached Marlow, the weather had turned, but we didn't mind. We found a comfortable place to stay, a charming hotel that was warm and dry, just what we needed after the last couple of days. We were all in good spirits, despite the weather, and Montmorency seemed to enjoy his new surroundings. He made himself at home, inspecting every corner of the room, looking for something to get into. We stayed in Marlow for 2 days, exploring the town and relaxing. It was a nice change of pace from the constant rowing. During our second day, we decided to visit the local market. The town was full of activity, and we enjoyed walking through the narrow streets, taking in the sights. Montmorency, as always, was in high spirits and ran around, barking at everything he saw. While we were at the market, Montmorency encountered a black cat. It was a surprisingly large cat, with sleek fur and a rather arrogant demeanor. It stood in the middle of the street, completely unbothered by the hustle and bustle around it. Montmorency, of course, immediately took notice. He started barking at the cat, his hackles raised, thinking it was a challenge. The cat, however, wasn't impressed. It simply looked at Montmorency with a gaze that could only be described as one of sheer indifference. Montmorency, not used to being ignored, barked louder, trying to get the cat's attention. But the cat just sat there, unmoving, its eyes half-lidded. It didn't even blink as Montmorency continued to bark and jump around. Montmorency, now realizing he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted, started to circle the cat. He was determined to provoke it into some sort of response. Finally, after a few moments, the cat stood up and stretched lazily. Montmorency took this as an invitation to charge, but the cat had other plans. With one swift movement, it turned and walked away, completely unfazed by Montmorency's antics. Montmorency stopped in his tracks, watching the cat walk away with a mixture of confusion and resignation. As Montmorency stood there, looking lost, I couldn't help but laugh. It was one of the funniest things I had seen in a while. Montmorency, the bold and fearless dog, had been defeated by a cat. A few moments later, he trotted back to us, tail between his legs, as if embarrassed by the whole ordeal. We couldn't stop laughing at the sight of him, and even George, who rarely showed much emotion, had to chuckle. Harris, however, was slightly more sympathetic to Montmorency's pride. "Poor thing," he said, patting the dog on the head, "but at least you gave it your best shot." We all agreed that Montmorency had tried his best, and though he didn't win, it was an amusing and memorable moment. The rest of the day was much quieter. We walked around the town, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere, and Montmorency, for his part, seemed to have forgotten all about the cat. He found a new interest in chasing squirrels, which was far more satisfying for him. As we continued our journey along the river, we stopped at a spot near Shepperton, a place with a long history. The riverbank here was peaceful, and the surrounding countryside seemed to stretch on forever. We were all in good spirits, and the weather was perfect, sunny, with just the right amount of breeze to make the journey comfortable. We were making great progress, and it felt like the perfect moment to stop and enjoy the tranquility of the scene. We found a lovely spot to camp, and George, as usual, started to grumble about the task of setting up the tent. But after some persuasion, he agreed to help. While George and I worked on the tent, Harris decided he would go for a walk along the river. He always enjoyed a good walk, and this was the perfect opportunity to stretch his legs. I was busy trying to get the tent set up when I noticed Harris was becoming agitated. He was staring at something across the river, his hands on his hips, looking very serious. Curious, I walked over to see what had caught his attention. To my surprise, Harris was glaring at a group of swans that were peacefully gliding across the water. There was something about the swans that seemed to have triggered Harris's competitive spirit. "We need to move," Harris declared. "We can't stay here. The swans are going to attack us." I raised an eyebrow, unsure if I was hearing him correctly. "Harris, what are you talking about? The swans are harmless." But Harris was insistent. "You don't understand. They're getting closer. I've seen it before. They'll come right at us if we're not careful. And when they attack, they don't stop. I tried to calm him down, but it was no use. Harris was already gathering up his belongings, ready to leave. We can't just sit here and let them come at us. I'm telling you, we need to go. Meanwhile, George had been listening to all this, and he couldn't help but laugh. Harris, you're being ridiculous, he said. They're just swans. They can't hurt us. But Harris wasn't convinced. As if to prove his point, one of the swans began to paddle in our direction, and Harris immediately jumped to his feet. See, I told you, they're coming for us. I watched as the swan approached the shore, clearly unbothered by Harris's dramatic reaction. The bird stopped at the water's edge and stared at us, as though it was waiting for us to make the first move. But instead of attacking, the swan simply turned around and glided away, returning to its group. Harris was speechless. He stood there, watching the swan retreat, and I could see a hint of embarrassment on his face. He didn't say a word, but I could tell he was a little bit relieved. Well, I said, I guess the swans aren't as dangerous as you thought. Harris nodded, still watching the swans, who were now peacefully swimming away. Maybe not, he said quietly, but I've seen what they can do when they're angry. We should still keep an eye on them. The rest of the evening passed without incident, and the swans didn't return. We finished setting up camp, and as the sun began to set, we sat around the fire, laughing at the ridiculousness of Harris's fear. It was one of those moments that, though it seemed trivial at the time, became a fond memory later on. As we settled into our tents for the night, I couldn't help but think about how different our trip would have been without Harris's wild imagination. His over-the-top reactions had certainly made things more interesting, even if they weren't always necessary. But in the end, we all enjoyed the adventure, swans and all. By the time we reached Oxford, we were all tired but in good spirits. The trip had been going wonderfully, and we were enjoying the peaceful pace of life on the river. Montmorency had a blast, charging around, barking at anything that moved, and getting into mischief at every turn. But the weather had turned, and the clouds above promised rain. So we decided it was time to stop for a couple of days and enjoy the city. We found a comfortable hotel near the center of Oxford, a perfect place to rest and recover from our adventures. We checked in, dropped our bags, and headed straight for a nice meal at a local restaurant. The food was delicious, and we all felt relieved to be off the boat for a while. Montmorency was thrilled with the hotel, but not for the reasons we had expected. He was more interested in the hustle and bustle of the hotel lobby than the comfort of the bed we had arranged for him. He darted around, sniffing everything and generally causing chaos. The next morning, the weather had changed for the worse. It rained relentlessly, and the river looked less inviting than it had the day before. Harris, George, and I spent the morning talking about how much we had enjoyed the trip so far. But as the hours passed, the rain continued without pause, and we began to grow restless. We had originally planned to continue our journey that afternoon, but the downpour made that seem unlikely. By late afternoon, we all agreed that we'd had enough. Harris, always the practical one, suggested that we head back to London. What's the point of continuing if it's just going to rain all the time? He asked. We've had our adventure, and we're all tired. Let's just go home. At first, George protested. He didn't want the trip to end so soon, but after a while, he reluctantly agreed. I suppose Harris is right, he said. It's not much fun sitting around in a wet boat. We made plans to head back to London the next day. But before we left, we decided to go out and enjoy Oxford while we still had the chance. We visited the Ashmolean Museum and walked around the city, taking in the sights. Despite the rain, it was a pleasant day, and we found a great deal of comfort in the knowledge that we were no longer at the mercy of the weather. That evening, we sat at a local cafe and enjoyed a hot meal. The day had been full of mixed emotions, relief at being off the river, but disappointment that our adventure was coming to an end so soon. Harris, ever the pragmatist, raised his glass in a toast. "Here's to 3 men well out of a boat," he said with a grin. We all laughed, and as we toasted to our short but memorable journey, we realized that even though the trip had ended unexpectedly, it had been full of laughter, surprises, and, most importantly, good company. In the end, that was all we really needed.